Hello, my name is Simon Bennett. I'm the ZAttack Proxy founder and project lead, and today I'm going to be talking about my perspectives from a decade of building Zap. So I'm going to start with, just to quickly run through, I'm going to start by explaining what Zap is for those of you who've never heard of it. I'm going to give a bit of the Zap history because I think that does explain how it got to where it is now and part of my journey. And then I'm going to talk about running a successful open source project, which hopefully Zap is considered. I will talk a bit about the application security changes that I've seen in the last 10 years, where we stand today, and a bit about the future of application security. Although I kind of hate looking into crystal ball, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. And I'll finish off with some takeaways. So I will start with what is Zap? And quite simply, it's a tool for finding vulnerabilities in web applications. Now, if you've come from the network security world, you'll kind of think of scanners which target known vulnerabilities in known applications. And Zap is kind of a different kind of beast. Zap tries to find new vulnerabilities in custom applications. So these are applications that typically no one has ever seen before. So there are no CVEs. There's nothing to go on. So what Zap does, Zap attacks applications in a very similar way to a manual penetration tester or a malicious attacker. It is, like all OWASP tools, completely free and open source. And it's a community project. That was something that was very important to me from the start, and I'll explain why soon. So we try to make sure that it's very welcoming to anybody who wants to join Zap, and it is, we hope, ideal for both newcomers and experts. And this is something we have found, when I started off, it was very much aimed at people new to security, but we found a lot of security experts using it as well. And in some ways, it's made a bit of a rod for our own back because we have to cope with, on one hand, people who know nothing about security, right up to people who are very experienced. But that's just the way it goes. But Zap is particularly good for automation, and that is one area where it's being used very widely. And indeed, we believe it is the world's most frequently used web application scanner. So a little bit about Zap history. So in 2009, I was a team lead. I was leading a small Java development team, which was developing an online service, a service that was considered security critical to the company that I worked for. Now, at that stage, I'd actually had no security training whatsoever. But we were aware that security was important, so we did our best to make sure it was secure, and I arranged a penetration test. And the whole idea really of that was to confirm that we'd done all the right things. That didn't really work out as planned. We got a couple of guys in to pen test the service. I put them in a room, and I spent some time with them explaining exactly how the service worked, gave them all the information, because I wanted to make sure that they had the best chance of finding any problems that there could have been. So explained everything and left them to it, and then just went back after 1 hour just to see how they were doing and see how they, if they needed any help. I walked into the room only to find one of them was actually logged into the administration console for the service with my credentials. They'd essentially gained super user access within 1 hour, and they didn't have those credentials. That was not the idea. So this was a bit of a shock. In fact, in this particular case, it wasn't a vulnerability with the service we developed that actually cracked the company's single sign-on system, the single sign-on system for the whole company. Technically, this was out of scope, but we were really pleased that they found that problem. But even though that wasn't a vulnerability in the service we developed, they still found plenty of other things. And they found vulnerabilities I'd never even heard of, like cross-site request forgery, and things like a cross-site scripting vulnerability slipped through as well. It was, it felt at the time a bit of a car crash. I've since learned that, as reports, security reports go, it wasn't that bad, and I've actually delivered worse ones myself. But at the time, it felt really bad. and I decided that I needed to do something. And upon reflection, I decided that I really wanted to do three things. I wanted to learn more about web security. And for me, this wasn't really, I wasn't just focusing on web security. I just saw this as another aspect of making a robust system. So it's similar in my mind to performance, scalability, usability, supportability, all these good things. And I must admit, I still think of it in those terms. Security is not an absolute. Having a perfectly secure service is no good if no one can use it. But I also wanted to find a tool which I could automate some security tests. Things like the cross-site scripting vulnerability that got through and missing headers. I was sure that all of those things could have been found by an automated tool. And, I wanted to find a tool that I could run against my software every night. And I also decided at that time that I've actually wanted to join an open source project. And I thought, well, I could actually combine these three things. I could find a friendly open source web security tool, and then I could use that to learn more about web security, and I could use that to automate the security tests. So it actually didn't turn out quite as easy as I thought. At the time, there were no actively maintained open source web security projects. This kind of surprised me, and I must admit, it felt wrong. But there were some ones which were abandoned, tools like Paros and WebScarab, and both of those happened to be written in Java. I was a Java developer, so I started looking at the source code and playing around with them. I also started learning the OWASP top 10. And I completely realized that this was not the be all and end all, but it was a really good place to start for me. I wanted to learn about the most commonly found vulnerabilities, and I started using some of these old security tools to play around with these kind of vulnerabilities in both my own applications and in some of the deliberately vulnerable ones. And as I learned, I decided that I thought it was important to start teaching some of the other people at the same company as me, particularly developers and QA functional testers. I thought it was really important that they would learn some of the things that I was learning, and I actually found it a great way to make sure that I actually understood things well enough. You don't realize, how well or little you understand something until you try to explain it to somebody else. So I started giving training courses, and the first question at the end was always, what tools should we use? So I decided I ought to have another look at the options, and I decided, I had thought about what are my requirements? And I decided I wanted something that was free. At that time, I didn't think I would be able to actually convince the company where I worked to pay lots of money for all the developers and functional testers to use a security tool. I wanted open source. I wanted it cross-platform. There were a lot of Windows developers there. I was developing on Linux, and I don't get the whole idea of tools only run on one platform anyway. I wanted it to be easy to use, and I wanted it to be maintained. And I looked at the options out there, and I decided the closest thing to that was Paros, or rather the version of Paros that I was hacking around with. And so I decided to bite the bullet, and I released Zap. So this was in 2010, and this is the email that I sent. And basically, a couple of things I want to draw your attention to. First is that, really from the start, I intended it as a tool for developers and QA functional testers. I didn't really think I didn't have the cheek to aim it as a tool for security people, although I did say that, they may find it useful. And secondly, I made very clear that it was completely free. There wouldn't be a pro version, and there never would be. And that's been something I think is very important to me, and because I think there is a real need for a tool like this. So I actually had a look and tried to find a screenshot from the very first version of Zap, and I couldn't actually find one. We did find one from Zap 1.2.0, but I do know that in Zap 1.1.0, we added the Active Scan, Spider, Brute Force, and Port Scan tabs. So my quick attempt at hacking a screenshot from Zap 1.0.0 is this. So, it does look quite straightforward, quite simple. But I've now actually, this is a screenshot from one of the most recent weekly releases of Zap. And this is not what you will see when you start Zap. But what I've done is I've installed all of the add-ons, and I've actually, by default, most of the tabs will be hidden, but I've made them all visible. So you can see there's a lot going on. There are actually many more options. There's loads of right-click options. So you can see Zap is now quite a big and complex project. What I want to do now is kind of talk about some of the first innovations that we've brought as part of Zap. I think many people, or some people, still seem to think that open source projects just copy commercial ones. But I think in terms of web security, Zap has led the way in many areas. So in 2011, I added daemon mode and the API. Automation was a very early goal for me. I couldn't get it in the first version, but this is something I wanted to make sure was available. And so Zap has been built around automation from an early stage. Something else we did, actually started internationalizing Zap very early on. And in 2011, we actually had full internationalization done. And I think this is actually very important. I don't understand why so many security tools and so many commercial ones are still English or American only. I think this is wrong, and I'm actually very proud that Zap is being translated into over 30 different languages. In 2012, we started doing weekly releases, and we've kept up doing that. So every week there is a new version of Zap, and if there are significant problems, we do re-release the weekly, but that's only happened a few times. And occasionally we don't do weekly releases, maybe over Christmas or something. But it's been pretty much every week since 2012 we've had a new release. Then in 2013, loads of things happened. WebSockets support was added, and this was actually part of Google Summer of Code. And Zap has had, was one of the first security tools to have WebSocket support, and probably still has the best support out there. The Ajax Spider, we found that the traditional Spider didn't cope with modern web applications very well. So the Ajax Spider now actually launches browsers and clicks on things controlled by Selenium. And that was in 2013, way before many other similar security tools. We launched the online add-on marketplace in 2013. Of course, all of these add-ons are completely free and open source. And in 2014, we launched both Zest and Plug and Hack. Zest is a scripting language, and Plug and Hack actually allowed you to control Zap from your browser. Then in 2014, we added support for client-side events, things like post messages. So you can actually fuzz post messages and intercept them, even though they're all completely in the browser. And in 2015, we added access control testing. So this allows Zap to actually try out functionality available to one user as another. And then things like, so we added the Docker images in 2016 and the package scans, and these have been incredibly popular. 2017, we added browser launch. This means we can actually launch browsers from Zap, and they're pre-configured to proxy through Zap and ignore any certificate warnings, which makes Zap so much easier. You just don't have to worry about configuring your browser in the same way. And 2019, we introduced the heads-up display, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But this basically brings a lot of the functionality of Zap into the browser. 2020, I think we were the very first security tool to be, or this DAS tool to be available in GitHub Actions. And in 2020, we already supported Swagger OpenAPI and SOAP, but we added GraphQL, which means that Zap is an incredibly powerful tool for testing APIs. And in this year, we've actually launched an automation framework, which makes Zap even easier to automate while providing access to many more features. So today, there's actually 3 project leaders. So myself, Ricardo, otherwise known as THC202, and Rick King-Thorin. And all 3 of us have admin credentials to all of the related services, all the services related to Zap. We have a core team, which is built up of the 3 leaders and at the moment 2 others. The core team kind of varies over time. 3 project leaders, we've been constant for some time, but basically any significant contributor gets asked to join the core team. Zap is very actively maintained. There are pull requests being made all the time. And we're doing a lot of releases. So we do a couple of releases a year, but as I said, we're doing week releases every single week. And Zap is getting quite big. We actually have 35 repositories in the ZA Proxy GitHub org. And it is a growing part of it's part of a growing number of commercial offerings. Zap was released as Apache v2 license from the start. And that's because I wanted companies to get involved and start contributing back to Zap. And we're starting to see that happen now. And as I mentioned before, it is the world's most frequently used web application scanner. How do we know that? Well, we have various stats, which I'll talk about later, but basically we've gone public with this claim and made sure our competitors know all about it, and none of them have contested it, so it must be true. So what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about running what's hopefully seen as a successful open source project. I think one of the key things you have to decide early on is whether you want to keep your team very small and focused, or whether you actually want to welcome new contributors. Now, I think it's actually easier to manage a small dedicated team, but that was never really something we considered with Zap. I started Zap because I wanted to learn about web security, and I wanted other people to be able to learn as well. I wanted to teach people, and I wanted people to be able to learn in the same way that I have. And this means we actually need to spend quite a lot of time with new contributors. You often have to spend a lot longer with a new contributor working on a piece of functionality that it would have done if you had done it yourself. But if you keep on doing things yourselves and don't bring new contributors in, then you won't get any more long-term contributors. So we spend time with new contributors, and many of them only stick around for a short period of time, which is a shame. But we keep doing it to make sure that we do get more people involved. I think it's important to accept very early on that it's no longer just your project. And that's something I'm very careful to do. It's not my project. I always talk about the fact that it belongs to everybody who's contributed to it. I think it's important to think in that way as well. There is definitely an aspect when running an open source project of spinning plates. There's always much too much to do, and you can only focus on a few things at any one time. And your focus changes over time. You'll see things that suddenly seem much more important. You'll go over, pay attention to those, get those going, and then you'll be able to leave them for a while and go and focus on other things. And unfortunately, every so often you'll hear a crash when a plate that you weren't paying attention to has crashed to the ground and you've got to pick up the pieces. And this brings me on to the importance of actually focusing and working out what to focus on at any one time and ignoring distractions. It's very easy for people to come along and make suggestions and give you ideas and think, oh, great, I want to do that now. But you often have to stand back and go, no, I've got to keep on doing what I'm doing. And hopefully there'll be time for me to do that later, or maybe I can get somebody else to do that new and exciting thing. I think documentation is really important for open source projects, and something we haven't always got right with Zap. So, I know there's lots of features that we've got that part of Zap which aren't well enough documented, and we get questions saying, why don't you support this? And we can go back to them saying, well, actually, we already do. And I think a key thing is persistence, making sure that you actually keep on plugging away. I think that's really important. And ignoring the detractors. There will always be people who will criticize what you do or compare you in a bad way with any other project. You've got to ignore those and focus on what you're doing. As has been said many times, when you run an open source project, you have to wear many hats. I think a lot of people who get involved in open source seem to come from the development world. So the whole idea of designing software and implementing and testing as well, hopefully, is not too much of a surprise. But you have to be things like a technical author. You need to document things, otherwise people don't know that they're there. You need to be a graphical artist as well, or at least put together things that look nice or look vaguely good. You need to support your users. You need, unless you're doing something really trivial, people have problems. They'll come across situations that you haven't seen before. You have to evangelize your product. You have to be a marketeer. You have to go out and sell it. You have to manage projects, and you have to manage people. As it's been said before again, managing developers is like herding cats. It is really non-trivial, particularly as, you're not paying them, they're just doing things they want to do. Another thing I think is really important is measuring everything you can. If you don't measure things well, you just don't know how you're doing. I actually started recording Zap downloads the very first day I released Zap, and I've been trying to record anything else that I can think of ever since then. It is hard getting good statistics for open source projects. Things like licenses and license fees are a great way of measuring how well you're doing, and we don't have those. And with open source, anyone can download them, can download it and use it. They don't have to tell you, and people don't tell us. But it's also quite hard to draw detailed conclusions. So if you look at this chart, if you can see it properly, it looks like in 2020, we actually had a big increase in Zap usage. In fact, we weren't getting any pings from the check from update requests when we're in daemon mode. That was only added in 2.9.0. So in fact, we're probably having a lot more people using Zap. We didn't know it. So what do we actually measure for Zap? One thing is direct downloads. And that's relatively straightforward, but we have deliberately chosen not to host Zap downloads on platforms where we can't get any statistics from them. Next thing is Docker pulls, particularly as Docker has proved so popular for us. But this kind of raises an interesting point, how difficult it is to understand what's really going on. For example, why did we get 6 million pulls in February 2021 and only 1 million in March? I have no idea. I don't know what's going on. I don't know why we had so many one month and relatively few the next month. So it's difficult to draw conclusions. So GitHub forks and stars, those are kind of straightforward things to measure. Then things like check for update requests and start pings. So for Zap, we check for updates and we have a kind of news item that we check on the start. The check for updates, we only check once per day per installation. Where the news items we check every time Zap starts. One of the reasons for doing that is we get 2 different data points because we're doing these checks via bit.ly URLs. So we actually find out when people make these requests. So these are actually very important things for us, but we do know that people can turn these off, and we know that people run Zap in environments where there's no external communication. So we just won't get those pings from people who run Zap in that way. We get website traffic, so we've got zaproxy.org now, and we measure things like the number of posts to the Google groups. I would love to add instrumentation to Zap. That's something we'd like to, definitely want to do, but we'd have to be very careful not to collect anything that would make any of our users nervous, particularly details of vulnerabilities, and we'll definitely have to have an option to turn that kind of instrumentation off if we do add it. I think getting contributors is always a challenge for open source projects. Zap has always been a community project. We've always stressed that we want people to get involved. And initially, I kind of thought and hoped that we would get security people involved. We do have some security people involved, but a lot fewer than I kind of hoped. And I think that's because they have a tendency to contribute to a certain other commercial tool. Developers, again, I was hoping a lot of developers would get involved, but we do have developers involved, but not as many as I was hoping. And I'm not sure why, but I think perhaps they either want to contribute to tools they use more directly, development type tools, or maybe they're nervous about contributing a security tool. They actually want to use the security tool, but they don't really want to have to understand it in detail. So the place we've actually got the most number of contributors is students. We've had loads of really significant student contributions. And in fact, we have a student hall of fame. So there are more than 20 students on there, and they've contributed really significant projects like WebSockets, the Ajax Spider, contributions to heads-up display, GitHub Actions, GraphQL support, loads of really key Zap features. And actually, the latest 2 students on that list are part of the Zap core team. So we do get students via programs like Google Summer of Code, but we also do direct mentorship. So we always do our best to help students who want to work on Zap, even if they've come to us directly, and some do. So if you want to work on Zap as part of your university course, then please get in touch. So one thing I think is actually really important is to try and get as much sponsorship as possible. Now, the other two leaders, Zap leaders, actually work on Zap in their own time, which I think is quite incredible. But I've been really lucky. So between 2012 and 2020, I worked at Mozilla, and they essentially sponsored 40 to 80% of my time working on Zap. I say luck, but I did actually choose to work at Mozilla over other companies because they said that they wanted me to work on Zap. And since 2020, I've actually worked at StackOrg, where I'm able to spend nearly 100% of my time on Zap. And that makes a huge difference to the amount of things you can do. So the more time you can spend on your project, the better, not surprisingly. So Google Summer of Code has been really great for us. We've had 16 student projects, and many of those students have carried on contributing to Zap well after the event. We had a Mozilla Winter of Security event. We had 3 students as part of a team, and Google Season of Docs, where we had 1 student, and that student carried on actually doing code contributions afterwards as well. But we've also run some competitions, and this is where actually having money donations to the Zap project has been really great, because what we've been able to do is we've been able to offer cash prizes for writing Zap scripts, writing unit tests, and we've got one open right now on creating new report templates for Zap. So one thing I'd like to touch on now is kind of the difference between innovations and evolution. And this is something that I'm still probably kind of struggling with a bit myself. We've had lots of Zap innovations, but 2 kind of stand out for me. One is Zest, and that's a graphical macro like language, which kind of domain specific language, which is really powerful. And the Zap heads up display. And that brings information from Zap into the browser and allows you to control Zap. It allows you to focus on the application functionality while you can see what's going on under the covers. And it's kind of unique amongst security tools. And I've actually not seen anything like it in any other tool either. However, even though these are incredibly innovative, we actually have seen limited take-up of them. They do have their fans, but for some reason they haven't taken off as much as I'd hoped, and to be honest, expected. Whereas we've had kind of evolutionary things, so things like the API, the Docker images, and the package scans. None of these are kind of dramatic changes, but they're things that have improved incredibly popular. So sometimes I think you have to realize you have to focus on evolution rather than innovation. But as an open source project, we can do both. So some of the ongoing challenges we have for Zap, and I kind of think will be the similar for many other open source projects. Time, actually getting more people to contribute to Zap, and so we want contributors, we want volunteers, but I really think direct sponsorship is key here. So we're really trying to get other companies to contribute to Zap. But yeah, getting more long-term contributors is really important. We want people to get involved, and then getting actionable feedback. We often, most people don't tell us they're using Zap or what they're using it for. We only find out people are using features when they start reporting issues. So getting good quality feedback is really difficult. But then there's managing loads of kind of spurious feedback you get and keeping up with the emails, the issues, the Slack mentions, group messages, Twitter, Stack Overflow. There's so many different ways people kind of comment or complain or report problems about Zap, and keeping on top of those is actually really tricky as well. And then, as I've mentioned before, kind of knowing what to do at the right time, focusing on the right things, and focusing on things you need to when you need to, and then changing your focus when it's important. So I'd now like to kind of talk about some of the changes I've seen in application security in the last 10 years. So I do think there is a much higher level of security knowledge amongst developers than was before. So more developers know the basics like cross-site scripting and SQL injection and appreciate that security is really important. So application security, so security teams and security considerations are being taken into account much earlier in the development process. But there really is an increase. There's there are some companies that are doing really well and really understand security. There's some companies that have just, not made a start at all. So there's an increasing gap between those two extremes. Newer languages and frameworks are taking security into account and are trying to be much more secure by default. And this is really good. And this is making a really big impression. And, I think it's clear that bug bounties have really taken off. But I think it is, it can be difficult to actually maximize their benefits. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Security automation, there's a lot more options. So there's a lot more things you can do with that now, particularly for open source projects, which can use many commercial tools for free. But I think, we all know that automation is not going to solve everything, and that, manual testing really is required, especially for high value sites. So where are we today? Well, I think everybody knows there is not enough security people. There are a huge number, there's huge demand, and there are not enough people to fill all of the open jobs. There is still not enough developer security knowledge. Now, I don't want to fall into the trap of just blaming developers. Developers do what they're told, encouraged, or incentivized to do. So if it's not a priority for management, then it won't get the kind of focus from developers that it needs. DAST, automated security tools like ZAP, DAST tools, used to only be run just before release, and that was way too late. They are now being used much earlier, particularly in development, thanks in part, I think, to ZAP. And SaaS tools, software analysis tools are starting to give much more actionable feedback. They used to give a huge and massive potential issues, which were difficult to wade through, and some of those are providing much more useful coverage, much more useful information, and focusing on the really important things. But software composition analysis, SCA, is a huge challenge. It's really difficult. There's a proliferation of libraries, and keeping them up to date and making sure they're all secure is incredibly difficult. So bug bounties have proved really useful, but they're not a panacea. So I was on the Mozilla Bug Bounty Committee, and we saw a significant drop in the quality and usefulness of findings. Now, I think, it's difficult to tell why that was, but I think it's partly due to the improving quality of our services, but it's also due to the competition from other bug bounties as well. And I think it's only fair to expect that people who take part in bug bounties are looking to get the most money with the least amount of effort. So it's really difficult to get really good findings unless you pay out a lot of money. And you'll get lots of findings you're not interested in at all, even if you scope the program really carefully. And I'm afraid to say that web security, there just aren't enough open source web security tools out there. There's still not very many. ZAP is one of the few web security tools out there. Web security tools are easy to create, but they're hard to maintain. And we've seen a lot of come and go. Very few stay the distance. So quickly touch on a bit of the future as I see it. I think it's, there's an old saying, you can't hack yourself secure. Things like web application firewalls are great, but they're sticky plasters. They're okay in an emergency, but they don't make systems secure. So you have to actually get security involved. From the very start, you have to get developers involved. Developers create secure systems, security people don't. And as I think we all know, the use of software is expanding. There is more software is everywhere. It's eating the world, and we just do not have enough security people. There are, the modern frameworks are getting much better, and they are preventing a lot of common issues. But we've still seen some new frameworks introducing old vulnerabilities. So just keeping up with the latest, greatest thing doesn't mean you'll be secure. Not surprisingly, I'm a big fan of automation, but I think there's going to be huge potential gains when we start integrating DAST, SAST, IAST, fuzzing, all these different types of security tools. And I think it's, there are various commercial tools that claim to do this, but I haven't tried them, and they're charging a significant premium. And I don't think these will take off until they're much cheaper, or hopefully they're open source options out there. And that's something I'm hoping that we can contribute to as part of Zap. And there's the old refrain, there's no silver bullet, and that is as true in security as it's ever been. So that means I think we need a blended approach. So, security is non-intuitive. Once developers have been exposed to security concepts, they get them and they start building more secure software, but they need training first. I think threat modeling is a really important way to think about security up front. It's a great way for the security team to interact with developers early in the project lifecycle as well. Security should be taken into consideration when choosing frameworks, and developers should know what security controls are available and when to use them. I mean, ideally, I think applications should be security aware, actually know when that they will be attacked and react accordingly. But that's kind of, another step down the road. Automation is absolutely key, particularly, should be run as early as possible. It gives you the best coverage and picks up problems early, allowing you to address them, whether it's lack of security training or missing security controls. Manual testing is really required. There's a lot of things that are really hard to automate, and I'm actually a big fan of getting QA involved. They're used to testing, they know about testing weird cases, and the ones I've trained actually really enjoy getting involved in security. But for high-value sites, you still need manual external pen testing. Systems developed as above actually become much more secure, and you get much more value from pen testers. Pen testers hate not finding significant issues. So when I was at Mozilla, we made sure our systems are pretty secure as they could be before we got pen testers in, and we got some really great findings just because halfway through the engagement, they were getting really frustrated. They hadn't found anything, and they just tried really hard. And of course, bug bounties are still there, but as I've mentioned before, managing them takes a bit of practice. So, future of Zap, this is it's tricky. I do find it difficult looking to the future of these kind of things, but more automation is definitely on the cards. I would love to put more self-configuration in. Zap is it's got loads of ways of configuring it, but then you have to know how to do that. And it's partly because we don't get enough input to know how to configure Zap best. I'm hoping we can start to improve that by getting more feedback. I definitely see more tools and services built on top of Zap. We're very friendly to commercial tools, and we try and make sure that Zap can be as easily integrated as possible. I really hope we get more contributors. We're definitely trying for that. But a lot of what we do will depend on who gets involved. So a few personal takeaways based on my experience. Luck does play a big part. I think I was in the right place at the right time. So I released Zap at a good time when there weren't other tools available like it. But I do think an open source project is for life, not just for Christmas. It's a bit of an old joke, but it's got a serious point. Short-lived open source projects won't make a big impact. You have to be in it for the long haul if you want to make a difference. But successful open source projects open lots of doors. I've not actually updated my CV since I started Zap. I've been headhunted for the last 2 jobs, and I've turned down job offers in some of the best-known tech companies in the world. But if we're going to make secure products, we have to get developers involved with security at the very start. But the main thing I think is, security is really hard, but it's actually great job security. So if you're thinking of actually moving into security, I can only recommend it. And last slide, what can you actually do? So right now, feedback. It is so valuable to open source projects. Even if you think you have no feedback, just telling them that they're using their project and that things are going well is really valuable. Longer term, it would be really great if you contribute to open source, particularly Zap. Don't be afraid to start a new open source project, but only do that if you intend to keep it up. And I do think helping others is absolutely key. That's what I've been trying to do as part of Zap, and it's just paid me huge dividends. And the final thing is just keep plugging away. Slow but consistent progress over many years will take you much further than a flash in the pan. And that's it. That's all I've got to say. Hope you've enjoyed it.